Welcome to the Shadow Knows, a podcast where we journey into the depths of psyche, mystery, and transformation. Hello, I'm Klara.
Hey, and I'm Maureen. We'll explore the hidden forces shaping our lives, relationships, and collective story. Today's episode, we're diving into one of the most vital archetypes, the lover. This tender and powerful energy connects us to meaning, beauty, and belonging. In a culture that often rushes past feelings, the lover is frequently distorted and diminished, yet it remains essential for connection, vitality, and an alive heart.
Today we have James Frazier joining us again. He is a Jungian coach, holotropic, and Neo-Shamanic Breathwork facilitator, and he will help us understand the lover archetypes through a Jungian lens. Welcome, James.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
So today, understanding the lover archetype feels especially charged in today's world, both deeply desired and deeply feared. And from a Jungian perspective, how would you describe the mature or integrated lover versus the shadow expression of the lover we so often see in modern culture?
Well, I think I'll start with the sort of the baseline of what Robert Moore gifted us with, which is an understanding of the lover as the energy of connection. It's what allows us to feel emotionally alive, sensually present, and meaningfully related to the world. So it's an incredibly important archetype. It tends to be a very problematic archetype, or really the most influenced by the lover, which is the first 4 years of life. It, on the one hand, an incredibly important energy, and on another hand, it's one of the energies that people have the most difficulty integrating. So it does have a bipolar shadow, and it's just one of those really problematic things that if you begin to understand it, you look around and you see it everywhere. One of the reasons is because it's connected to our sense of connection to another, to intimacy, and therefore to sexuality. We could spend days and weeks discussing the problems of sexuality. Not without reason that Freud actually looked at this area in most of his explorations because he realized that this drive of sexuality was the most problematic for people to integrate. And that turns out to be true. I don't think I've ever met any person in the world, up to this point anyway, who's had not some struggles, sometimes massive struggles with the whole issue of sexuality. But the lover archetype is not just about sexuality. Again, it's the thing that allows us to appreciate being in a body. It's the thing that allows us to appreciate beauty, to be connected to nature. It is one of the most problematic aspects of it.
In Carl Jung's correspondence with Bill Wilson, who was the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Jung suggested that alcoholism is rooted in a deep spiritual thirst, a longing for union that cannot be satisfied by substances. What he famously described as spiritus contra spiritum. How do you see this understanding reflected in the shadow side of the lover archetype? And in what ways does recovery, particularly through AA or maybe any 12-step group, help transform compulsive longing into conscious connection, meaning, and relationship?
So let me back up and cover that part of it. Like all the major archetypes that Robert Moore laid out following other people like Tony Wolff, his discovery was that these archetypes are not just a pattern of behavior, they're not just the energy of a particular psychic behavior, but they also contain a bipolar shadow, meaning there's an active and a passive side to the shadow. In the lover, where we have problems in this early experience, particularly of amount of mothering, nurturance that we got, the lack of it or too much of it. What happens if the lover archetype is not brought into a mature expression, it tends to either dominate us or disappear. And so we either are flooded with it or we're out of touch with it. And that means there's two bipolar shadows. So if you think about having too much lover, what would that mean? You would probably be seeking things outside of yourself. You would not be able to tolerate many of the normal things of life because you would feel empty. You feel like you're not connected, like you never got what you needed. What we see is a movement into addiction, because addiction really is the compulsive lover. So there's all this compulsive behavior, attempts at pleasure, attempts at saging pain, and the lover really truly is the plane of pain, so to speak, because it doesn't have natural boundaries like the lover does. It doesn't have the detachment of the magician. It doesn't have the qualities of blessing of the royal energy. So the lover is where we feel all the emotional pain. And thus, if we don't have a good grounded, balanced lover, we tend to get possessed by it, and that turns into addiction. Or we tend to be on the other side of it, which we could call the impotent lover, again, not just in a sexual sense, but in the sense that a person's just losing vitality or losing connection to life. And you hear very frequently people say, I just don't have any meaning in my life. I don't have any enthusiasm. I don't have eros. I don't have excitement. I don't have enthusiasm. When we fast forward to the question then that you asked me about, which is referencing a very famous letter that was a correspondence between the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, and Carl Jung. Many people don't know the story of Jung's pivotal, I would say, being one of the early links in the chain of events that led to Alcoholics Anonymous. And later in life, Bill Wilson wrote him this correspondence acknowledging his influence. Jung had a patient who was a chronic alcoholic, had worked with him for about a year, stayed sober during that year, came back to America and promptly relapsed. And then went right back to Switzerland to work with Jung again. And Jung basically said to him, well, you're helpless. The only possible answer for you is a powerful spiritual experience. And then that led to a series of events, which led to some folks getting sober through a religious group. And then those folks in turn influenced Bill Wilson. But Jung's recognition was that on one lens through which you could look at addiction is that it's a low-level, aborted thirst for spiritual wholeness. Does he mean that everybody's walking around that it's an alcoholic or a drug addict is actually a spiritual seeker? No, of course not. What I am saying is that they're seeking wholeness. By that means that they're tremendously fragmented and feel unwhole and feel unattached and unconnected. You can see this most clearly if you go to any of our prisons in the United States, because most of the people in that prison have never actually had adequate nurturance. Many of them come from broken homes. Many of them don't have the parental connections. Many of them didn't get the nurturing that they needed in that early experience, and thus are deeply wounded and feel alienated. And then you wind up with a hole in the psyche, which then the archetype comes in and fills up, and then the demands start becoming archetypal and their level. And then that's what leads to addiction, which leads to increasingly compulsive and greater need, in the case of a substance, of more and more and more of that substance. And the person can't see that they're completely destroying their life until generally the very end of it. So this is one of the most important letters I think you could ever study from Jung, because he really comes very close to saying that this desire for wholeness and connection is not just limited to addicts, alcoholics, and heroin addicts, other kinds of addictions. It's really universal. We are all longing for that connection. Now, there are a lot of different lenses that you could look through that, but one of the ones that I would say in the modern world is we have a very difficult time being in the body. We have a very difficult time connecting. We have a difficult time with sensuality. When you mention sensuality, people automatically think sexuality, and that's not necessarily the case. And many of us are walking around like James Joyce's famous character from Ulysses named Mr. Duffy. The line is, Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body. We're all up here in our heads. We're all, thinking that our body is what gets our heads to various meetings and workplace events. The idea of being really deeply connected to the body in a sensuous way takes you into all sorts of different directions, not the least of which is the whole area of shame. And I believe we're one of the most shame-based cultures that's ever existed. And on the one hand, we flip from extreme sexuality to the other hand, extreme repression and absence of that. And we bounce back and forth. So there are huge numbers of people that can't really play and display. They really are kind of shrinking back because of shame. A healthy connection to this lover archetype really does demand the other archetypes, especially the development in the warrior. But in this particular example, what I would go farther and say is that the program that has been the most successful for dealing with alcoholism, Alcoholics Anonymous, works primarily because it provides all these things that the addict is not getting and unconsciously or secretly seeking in the substance itself. It teaches responsibility. It teaches warrior functions. It teaches connection. It teaches asking for help. It teaches the social connection. And part of that comes about through getting honest. People don't go to AA and dress up and tell everybody how great they are. They go to AA and they talk about their shadow. They talk about all their bad parts. and they're not ostracized for that. At AA, they're actually blessed for that. So that combination of things and the person's dedication and working those 12 steps is what is responsible and makes possible for some people recovery from addiction. And not only recovery, but going way beyond just normal everyday existence.
The lover archetype is really about embodiment, to feel the body. For a woman, it's the closest thing to be in the body. However, our culture and our history was all about repressing all of that. And it just made me think of Jung's era, the Renaissance, how the repression of sensuality and sexuality, not just in men, but especially for women, what the effect must have been on the female psyche. Any type of women's emotional expression was just a hysteria. There was a label for this natural way of being of women could probably cause this so-called hysteria in that era.
I'm not sure I could bring much light to that specific question, although it is a fascinating thing to think about these early explorers, these pioneers of depth psychology particularly, and the fact that Freud had numbers of cases of hysteria in the 40 years that I've been doing this personal growth work. I've never run into anybody who had hysteria, so there may be some quite powerful validity. I mean, it is interesting to look at the list of things that you could be committed if you were a woman to an insane asylum in the early 1900s. Some of them are pretty mundane, such as reading too many novels. We well know there was a lot of abuse and things of that nature. At the very least, you could say, of course, hysteria is absolutely, in some sense, trying to connect you to the body because it's paralyzing one of the body parts. In the case of like a limb becoming paralyzed because of some conflict within the psyche. I also believe that there is a repression of not just the feminine expression of feelings and affects, especially in men. I mean, if you get hurt in some situation, you're supposed to get up and rub some dirt in the wound and keep going. And the worst thing for you to do is to cry. My God, you'll be ostracized immediately. So there are lots of us that got really wounded in our feeling function and our ability to express by the cultural overlays. And not all of it was repression either. We have a whole group of people, my generation, the normal, natural experience for a child to be breastfed by the mother was interrupted by science. No doubt well-meaning and, in parentheses, probably a bit of capitalism influence, but they came up with this thing called formula. And a woman didn't have to risk somebody seeing her naked in public. She could just heat up the bottle, never thinking about that's interrupting a biological and psychological and perhaps even spiritual process of union that has been going on for as long as we've been on the planet. Nobody thought anything about it. And huge numbers of women in the 1950s switched from breastfeeding to formula. Now, no doubt there were some people who probably were saved by that formula, so I don't want to present myself as a complete Luddite, but on the other hand, I've worked with lots and lots of people around the birth trauma and the early experiences of this imprinting and this emotional wounding from lack of union. It sets up a situation where the attachment patterns can be one where the union is always tentative. It's not you can't count on it. And that sets up a fundamental background anxiety. And then that opens up a hole in the lover, and then the archetype swoops in, and then boom, you've either got the flooding lover where you're seeking emotional connection with things outside of yourself. Now, lots of children attach to their toys, so I'm not trying to pathologize all of childhood. If you're still connected to your stuffed animal when you're 12 years old in a way that it sends you into anxiety when you think about going to sleep over with a friend because you can't take your stuffed animal, I would argue you've already got some attachment disorder in play. If you're sucking your thumb till you're 9 or 10 years old, there's some attachment disorder going on there. We've done some things that really were wrong in terms of helping people with this lover. And then the biggest thing I would say is the problem for men is that we no longer initiate males. When they hit puberty, they are flooded with sexuality. And so the potential for all sorts of projections happens, and they're not getting balanced in their warrior. And it's the warrior that balances the lover. You have to have these two in sync, because if you don't have a lover, for example, and you have pure warrior, you're likely to go into sadism. You may start getting off on hurting other people. If you have a balanced lover, you won't do that. And consequently, if you don't have a balanced warrior with a lover, that lover tends to either dominate or disappear. It turns to pathological situations.
As a former thumb sucker, I was.
Well, again, I'm not trying to psychopathologize childhood. I'm just trying to say that, look, folks, I won't ask you to answer this question on air, but for all of those of us who were and those who might be listening to this, one way to think about that is you either probably weren't breastfed, or the breastfeeding was terminated way too early, or it was just very inconsistent. And this may have had nothing to do with your mother. For example, you could have a mother who could not physiologically produce milk, therefore she could not breastfeed. So again, please don't ever interpret what I'm saying as mother blaming, although of course we have to look at failures in parenting, because that's a very real thing, because often our parents didn't get these knowledge and this understanding. But I would say those things go together. And so if I'm still have an object transfer at Freudian sense, when I'm 12 years old with my stuffed animal, then I'm probably going to have some delayed development. And I'm probably going to be too much in lover. And so I should be very cautious when I start seeking pleasure, because I will not be able to seek pleasure without it. It won't have any containment. It's the best way to say it. The mature lover can have pleasure, but with containment. So there are some people who can go and have, a couple of drinks, and they have a third drink. They don't feel any better. They start feeling worse. With a person with addiction tendencies, they have a third drink and they feel better. And they have a fourth one and they feel better than that. And there's not a containment to it. And so that's what leads to all the problems with too much lover, is too much lover without containment. And it's only the warrior that can provide that, because the lover has no boundaries. I hope that kind of makes sense. I know we could, again, spend a week talking about this particular dynamic.
My next question, how do early attachment patterns shape the lover's shadow? Just wondering if there was another example of how those early attachment patterns shape us.
Thing that's coming up for me most, which I think you're probably trying to get at, is that what other problems develop if you have an unintegrated lover energy. And if you think about this, any energy, these archetypal patterns especially, they're all in our psyche. We all have all of these. It's a matter of if we have them conscious, and we have them balanced, and we have them regulated. And if we don't, then they're unregulated and they're unintegrated. And an unintegrated, unregulated lover energy means I'm out of touch with it. That means it's unconscious. And if it's unconscious, the likelihood is it's going to project. So then what happens is I have all these unmet needs, and I find somebody who fits my internal idealized other, the partner, and I start projecting all this lover onto her. And I'm expecting her to fulfill all of my unmet needs. If I haven't gone through these initiation to get some of the other ones balanced, I'll project my unmet mother attachment needs onto her. I'll project my lover intimacy needs onto her, and then I can become hypersensitive to when she's not fulfilling those. So all of us are familiar with the falling in love, that first magical stage that's just overwhelming. It makes everything else fade into the background, and it is glowing. And then that lasts anywhere from a few weeks, a few months, maybe if you're really lucky, a couple of years, but then it starts falling off, especially if you start living with the person. You start having to deal with their dirty socks in the wrong place for the 100th time. And so the projections start falling off, and now we're with a real human being, and we think to ourselves, man, I really screwed up here, didn't I? Because I thought she was Aphrodite and, mother goddess all wrapped into one, and I discovered, no, she's just a normal woman. And besides that, she's starting to talk back to me. I don't like that. And, she's seeing my flaws. And this is what happens in addiction of all kinds. I start looking outside of myself for something that is really an internal process. If I project all this onto my partner, I expect her to do it all. It's funny almost, if it weren't so tragic, to go back and look at some of the advertisements in the 1940s and the 1950s. Have this stereotypical image of the woman meeting her husband at the door as he came home from work with his briefcase, and she would have his slippers and his drink and his pipe, and expect him to go sit in the living room while she fixed dinner for him. Most males did project all their lover onto the female in their relationship. Well, that's problematic. You think, well, we've made a lot of corrections to that. Well, in some sense we have, and we have brought a lot of consciousness to that, but we're still a long way from men integrating their lover. We're a long way from men integrating their warrior. So without those two, you're not really going to be very effective at integrating the lover.
That even too much of nourishment and too much mothering can also affect the lover archetype. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, I can, because often if you get too much, then what happens is you start falling into one of the other archetypes, which is the king baby syndrome. You start expecting everybody to do everything for you, and you are trying to regress back to that first stage of birth where we're getting all of our needs met. It's kind of a paradisiacal world, but everybody's there to serve you. And there's a little bit of this in most addictions. There's a big gap with the addict's internalized, idealized version of who they should be and how others should treat them and how they really are and how others really treat them. And that big split creates an enormous amount of emotional tension. So some of the addiction is trying to assuage that. If you get too much mothering, then you don't develop. Or when you get to be a teenager and some item becomes quite popular, like a pair of sneakers branded with some sports hero, and the mother goes out and buys you 6 pairs, one of every color. You get too much of everything. You never struggle. You never learn to do for yourself. And so you get very inflated, and then again, the demands become archetypal. And I expect everybody to treat me as if I were the king. Thought about this very deeply, but you could probably easily go into the impotent lover by saying, if I love somebody and I open up to intimacy, they're going to swamp me. They're going to try to possess me. They're going to just eat me alive. So I better just go off into this island and not really have relationships. So I think it could work, probably both ways.
What are the core functions of a healthy lover energy in the psyche?
Joy is what comes to my mind. The capacity to take pleasure in being alive, quality of aliveness, versus people who are overwhelmed and struggling with rationalizing that there's no point to this, that life has no point. It's absurdity. You're born, no matter what you manage to accomplish or put together, you're going to die. It's kind of that depression, feeling of deadness, lack of enthusiasm. I do believe connection fits in this tremendously. And of course, I think there are a lot of therapists who would agree with me that the vast majority of their clients coming to them have some issues around connecting, or certainly some issues with their current person that they're trying to be the most connected to, their intimate partner. It's also connected to us having a sense of meaning, not the cliched, what's the meaning of life? What brings me meaning in my life? And that doesn't necessarily have to be something very highbrow and metaphysical. I might have a hobby that brings me just tremendous joy and allows me to get through the mundaneness of life. Once I get through the mundane, I know I have that thing to go to. So it's sort of the mountaintops that allow me to deal with flatlands. But just a sense of joy that I'm conscious, joy that I'm alive, joy that I'm in this situation. That involves sensory, of course, aesthetics, appreciation of art, appreciation of beauty, nature, connections. If you really have a very healthy lover, you may be one of those folks who just loves being out in the woods. I think ultimately for most of us, since we are social creatures, there are very, very few of us who can live life isolated. We need to be able to connect with others. For most of us, we're much happier in monogamous relationships. I think most of us have a need to share life with someone. It's just a lot more enjoyable when I can have someone who I am intimately connected with, who I can be the most vulnerable with. I think you could probably teach a machine to fake or to pretend that it's emotional, but I don't think that's a quality of machine. I think you've moved away from the lover, at least, let me put it that way. And of course, we know this even from sexuality. Sexuality can spin off into just a kind of sports sex, so to speak, or notches on the bedpost kind of thing. It really leaves most people quite unsatisfied. It doesn't bring true sensuality. It doesn't bring true emotional connection. That type of sexuality doesn't lead to personal growth unless you wake up to the fact that that's your shadow and have to go through a lot of work around it. Yeah, it could. So that's one way. But it's not the deeply satisfying emotional relationship that most of us thrive on.
So, James, that kind of stirs up a question in me. You said something very special about being a human and to embody this lover archetype. But I also heard you say a while back that the lover archetype is also one of the most problematic ones out of these 4. And is it particularly because the lover is vulnerable to collapse, meaning like a boundary collapsing?
Well, one is it doesn't have the capacity for boundaries, so therein is the problem. It also is deeply connected to this early psychosexual developmental part of life that, again, to give credit to Freud and his followers, did so much early work around, because we don't come into the world with an ego. We're still one foot in the archetypal world and one foot in this reality, and it takes about 3.5 years before these little clumps, little islands of consciousness begin to collect together enough to form a sense of I, which is the ego in the Jungian sense is the center of consciousness. So we're very vulnerable to things like anxiety around attachment, because initially, of course, mother is food. Without mother, you die. Well, that's pretty fundamental. Long before you're concerned about pleasure, you're concerned about survival. In the modern world, we're doing some things around birth that we're not really thinking through very deeply. I mentioned the formula thing from the 1950s, but we've also had another phenomenon where we're not allowing the normal, natural progression of birth to happen, because we've doubled the number of cesarean sessions since I've been doing breath work. It was 18% when I started in 1986. I'm not arguing against it. I'm not trying to claim to be a medical person, but I have a sneaking suspicion that we didn't suddenly need to double the cesarean rate because of necessarily anything other than possible malpractice insurance. Difficult births are just a lot easier to control with that, and from the doctor's perspective, it makes more sense. It's less risky. But then we're not thinking about, well, what is the psychological impact of that? We've had sort of, well, there's nothing important prior to the onset of actual birth. And we've definitely proven that with Groff's work and with breath work. That's absolutely not the case. We know now that the birth trauma is one of the biggest influencers of us of all. It's one of the biggest traumas that most of us ever go through. So I'm saying the lover is more problematic because it's the first energy we're supposed to really be in. Mother's supposed to be in lover when she has us, and she's supposed to be able to be channeling, of course, a certain amount of queen as well. This is why when women go through the puberty initiation, they don't go into warrior, they go into lover. They go from lover to more lover. And they don't start coming on to warrior till after midlife. Whereas the male trajectory is we're thrown from lover into warrior. And it's because of this DNA testosterone agenda that comes upon us. And in traditional cultures, it was understood that if you didn't steward that warrior energy, it would turn problematic. There's an old saying, if the boys don't feel the warmth of the village, they'll burn it down in order to feel the warmth. And so we come into the world of lover when we are the least developed. The whole of childhood is supposed to be lover energy. That's why I'm fundamentally opposed to continuing to push back the dates of when we give children iPads and expect them to start producing scientific papers. We need to let them be children. We need to let them play. And most primitive cultures understood this. They didn't require the children to start producing until they'd gone through this second birth of the puberty ritual. They also did not introduce them to the sacred ideas of the tribe or our conceptual philosophical ideas. We have to wait till they have their second birth. Then we introduce it. We're kind of mucking up some things. And the result is that we have a lot of difficulty with people coming to maturity because they're wounded in the lover. That makes it more difficult to do the other ones because we need this firm baseline of safety, a sense of, is the universe safe or not? Am I going to be taken care of or not? Or the people that are supposed to take care of me and be there for me, are they going to be? And if we get a good enough parenting experience, then we can begin to deal with the frustrations of the time we don't get what we want. Just as too much of the lover is wounding. And when we have that wound, it's like the Buddhists say, wherever there's a hole, the rhinoceros horn will enter. And that's just a metaphorical way of saying the psyche abhors a vacuum. So if you have a hole in the lover archetype sweeps in. And now you don't have human level lover needs, you have archetypal lover needs.
We could talk about like the 3 types of love that are often named in Greek thought, and then later in Christian and Jungian discussions, eros being passionate, and then the philia, which is the affectionate love or maybe friendship. Then there's the agape, which is the self-giving type of love. Is there anything that you'd like to comment on that as it relates to the lover archetype?
But the thing that pops in my mind is that for healthy expression of all of those 3, would require a healthy lover. And any one of them, one could potentially see, especially in, of course, the eros, but anyone, you could see potential problems in all of those. Just as an example, again, this I haven't thought about this very deeply. So if you look at someone on Facebook and their complaint is that Facebook only allows them to have 5,000 friends and they're at 4,999 and they don't know who they're going to let be that last slot. Well, that's probably a person who's gone into the second one of those way too much. I mean, honestly, I can't keep track of 25 close friends. I'm trying to say you could have a problem in just the collection on a superficial level and think you're really doing something. Yeah, I would say, again, the thing that just kind of pops into my mind is that, well, yeah, all three of those to be expressed in a healthy manner would require an integrated lover.
James, for listeners who feel disconnected from their capacity for deep connection, joy, or aliveness, what are some ways they might begin to awaken or integrate the lover?
Well, first, I think it would be very helpful to begin to look at where you're not integrating the lover. And often what you'll discover is that you have a problem with boundaries. And that's because you're not actually in the warrior. So there's a kind of funny thing about this fourfold model. One of the fast ways to get one of the sides of this balanced is to look at the opposite side and try to develop it as well. So in other words, you're not just going to work on your lover, you need to work on your lover-warrior dynamic. And of course, as soon as you start doing that in a meaningful way, you'll run right into your abandonment fears. And it'll make you want to run back into the lover. But if you just get honest and do some serious self-reflection, journaling processes, talking with other people, and just ask yourself, how good am I at boundaries? Do I have the capacity for no? Do I have the capacity for containment? And that may lead you into some of the things that you probably need to do to better bring yourself into an alignment, into a place where you can experience integration with the lover. But I would say things that connect you to the body in a meaningful way. If you develop a more integrated lover, to be able to have more meaningful, more passionate, more sustained interest in sexuality and intimacy exchanges with another human. For many of us, I'll include myself in that, I had a real problem with my body as a child. A lot of shame around my body. I wasn't really built like all the other boys I grew up with. I wasn't athletic. I was clumsy. I had like 3 left feet. I had a lot of issues around rejection of myself and my body. And of course, I didn't develop these, but one could see where things like eating disorders get so connected to all this because they have to do with the body, they have to do with the mother, they have to do with the taking in of the mother in the form of food. As much as we were experiencing sexual difficulties at the turn of the century, it may very well be that now we are experiencing issues food related. Center for Disease Control, they have this really interesting map that you could click through and it shows you the obesity rates every single year. You click and it'll go to a new year, and it starts off really pretty tiny in 1950, and then it's just unbelievable. Now we're a huge percentage of people are struggling with obesity. I will admit that a good bit of that has to do with the food and the way it's marketed and packaged, but I think a good bit of it has to do with some of this attachment business. I think it has to do with our failure to have meaningful, culturally sanctioned rituals that help people move through these transition time periods and experience initiation processes that would help them integrate these energies. That's part of what we're doing this series about, is to try to help more people become aware that these are very powerful forces in the psyche, and you have to become conscious of them to start working on them. Doing anything that would get you connected to the body, and by extension, nature. I think nature is one of the most healing things that one can begin to do this lover work. To just go out in nature, and instead of going on I'm going to hike 25 miles today, you'd be better off to hike 250 feet and see that whole 250 feet and become amazed at the microcosms of life that are in there. But we're so goal orientated, we got a backpack on, it's got 40 pounds of stuff in it, and we're hauling off on our 25-mile hike today. Slowing down is part of this, to be able to see things, to be able to really connect to things in a feeling way, to have less detachment so we're not spinning in our magician. Practices like breathwork, for example, which I'll put a shameless commercial plug for, help get you connected to the body because they involve a lot of somato-emotional release. You also get more permission to do emotional release. If you're struggling with that, try to find either a therapy group or a self-help group or a place where you can feel safe, where they are trying to help people express emotions. Get connected to your own creativity, artwork. and appreciate it. Even if all you can draw is a stick figure, try to appreciate that, because you can actually be tremendously creative with stick figures. I know this to be a fact because that's the level that I draw at. And I am able to do a lot of very powerful journaling with stick figures. So you don't have to be Picasso, you don't have to be Van Gogh or Rembrandt to be able to appreciate your own art. Then, of course, that's going to lead you into shadow work, because your critic and all those critical voices you got growing up about your creativity are going to come roaring forth. And so you're going to have to do some work on that as well. So if I'm at the grocery store and I notice that there's a person working at the end of the checkout counter, and I imagine that, hundreds of people pass by that person every day without even looking at them. And I take the time to notice that they have a name tag on and it says John. And I just take the little extra effort to say, thanks, John. I really appreciate that. I don't know how that might affect that person, but it could certainly affect me. Wow, I wonder what his life is like. So you see what I'm getting at? We slow down from our hyper achievement modality and start to appreciate things. And it's funny, I'm 73 years old. I'm entering in the last phase of my life. I appreciate things in a way I never could when I was young. I appreciate every day. And you could cynically say, well, that's because you're approaching death. Well, yeah, but on the other hand, I really am much better at noticing things that are beautiful than I was in my earlier life. I'm much more happy in the sense that I'm not chasing happiness. It's a result of the growth work I've done and the appreciation work I've done, and frankly, getting this lover better balanced, because I don't mind admitting this is the most problematic area of my life. I'll still be working on this probably till the day I die. I'll certainly still be working on trying to bring forth a more and more mature warrior to balance this stuff out. But I've made some progress. And in that, I have much more appreciation for some of the small things that I would have not even noticed before. And suddenly I have great interest in them. So my capacity for living is actually much, much bigger than it was when I had much more physical capacity.
I listened to Robert Moore, his lecture on the lover, and what stuck with me was when you're in a lover, you're entering the Garden of Eden, and you have to make sure that you take care of it, and you go there every single day, you visit it, and you care for it. So thank you.
Thank you, James, for guiding us through such an important exploration of the lover archetype and reminding us that love in its mature form is not self-erasure or compulsion, but presence. For each of us, the invitation is to recognize where the lover lives within, to remain connected without losing ourselves. Thanks, everyone. I'm Maureen.
And I'm Klara. And thanks for listening to The Shadow Knows. If today's episode resonated with you, we invite you to subscribe, give us a like, and share it with friends. And join us again as we continue exploring the hidden layers of the psyche. Until next time, may you walk gently with your shadow, and may its wisdom guide you home. And remember, the shadow knows.
The shadow knows.